Lewis Hamilton really doesn't like driving F1's current cars, which are giving him a unique problem in his ultra-successful career. For the first time, F1's most successful driver ever is struggling to adapt to the demands of his machinery, to the point Hamilton's admitted he sucked in qualifying for a long time in this era of F1 cars, which he calls really frustrating to drive. Teammate George Russell is battering Hamilton in qualifying on head-to-head form, starting ahead of him 10 times in 14 events so far this season. And while Hamilton's bleak prediction back in May that he wouldn't outqualify Russell at all for the rest of 2024 hasn't quite come to pass, the trend is clear: Russell's faster, at least over one lap. Despite that, Hamilton's yet again ahead in the championship, but we'll come to how his fight against Russell and his wider 2024 form is really playing out later in this video. One of the most intriguing developments of the season is Hamilton's admission of a driving style incompatibility, and how critical he still was of himself even once his form had started to turn around. Hamilton's issues have largely been a subplot through Mercedes' struggles since the ground effect era began in 2022, but have become more prominent this year due to Russell's form and the team's trajectory. Hamilton's core skill, often seen to devastating effect over his career, is his ability to brake super late. His sensitivity with the brake pedal and how he's feeling the grip allows him to gather it together without locking up and carry the speed into the corner with the car on the right trajectory without losing time on the exit. Slow corners are generally where the real lap time gains are to be found, and by driving to his maximum in these corners, Hamilton's been producing plenty of wow moments for almost 2 decades. There's been no unexpected rear sliding, no big bleeding of lap time on corner exit, no egregious spikes in tyre temperature. But F1's modern ground effect era isn't letting that come naturally. The current cars are the biggest and heaviest F1's ever had, and everything about them, the aero, the weight, the mechanical platform and the tyres, has essentially exacerbated some anti-Hamilton characteristics. It's very easy for these cars to be on a knife edge between an unpredictable rear end or chronic understeer, depending on the corner speed and profile. Hamilton says these cars don't like being brake late with a sharp rotation deeper into the corner in what is commonly referred to as V'ing the corner off. Instead, they reward braking a little earlier, rolling the speed through the corner in more of a U-shape, which Hamilton says he hates. The way Hamilton wants to attack a corner late on the brakes with a big steering input has either been met with a lazy front end that's understeering too much, or has invited the car to snap to oversteer. That triggers sliding and spikes tyre temperature, which causes other problems entirely, but whatever consequence Hamilton's faced with, it costs vital lap time and saps him of confidence. Having revisited every single qualifying performance so far in 2024, reviewed onboard footage and compared telemetry between Hamilton and Russell, we picked out some examples of how this has manifested itself. Let's start at the beginning in Bahrain, where Hamilton qualified just over 2 tenths slower than Russell, and we'll look specifically at the turn 4 right-hander at the end of the opening sector. This shows 2 distinctly different approaches from the 2 drivers. Russell brakes fractionally earlier but starts turning in much later, looks a bit more confident and is generally in a bit more control. Hamilton brakes later but starts turning in earlier. This loads up the car more gently, which could be a sign that Hamilton's wary of the rear stepping out if he turns in too aggressively, but it is also consistent with making the entry more narrow and then trying to have a sharper rotation mid-corner. But that is hard to do in these cars, so while Hamilton gets closer to the geometric apex, he still has more lock-on through the corner, and here suffers a small slide, whereas Russell is on a better line, is able to wind the lock off quicker and get on the power earlier. From entry to exit, Hamilton loses around a tenth, and from what we can see across various qualifying sessions in 2024, this is actually quite a common occurrence. But there are other different examples as well, one of the best being in Australia at the end of March, when Hamilton's tendency to slightly overreach was why he got knocked out in Q2 instead of Russell. The first notable time loss to Russell comes at the turn 3 right-hander, the first slow corner on the track, where Hamilton brakes slightly later and has a slide mid-corner as a result. But later in the lap is a good example of Hamilton's style working in his favour, as he gains a chunk of time over Russell at turn 11, where Hamilton does a great job to slow the car down after braking later, gets the front turned in and gets back on the power quickly enough to gain about a tenth overall. That puts Hamilton on course to make it through to Q3 at Russell's expense, but in the penultimate corner he brakes too late, has an inevitable slide mid-turn that delays his return to the throttle for far too long. It may have also overheated the rear tyre slightly, as he then has a compromised run through the final corner as well. An even more egregious example of being punished with an early elimination was April's Chinese Grand Prix, where Hamilton got knocked out in Q1. Okay, the big mistake came at the hairpin at the end of the long back straight, where braking fractionally later caused a lockup that sent Hamilton deep and cost him 0.4 of a second. But earlier in the lap there had already been a substantial 0.15 second loss to Russell in one corner. Turn 6, the slow right-hand hairpin. Hamilton went in too deep on the brakes, had a fractionally lower minimum speed and was later getting back on the throttle. We could reel off several more such examples later in the year, from Imola in May and Canada in June, but this isn't intended to be a blow-by-blow of Hamilton's seasons or mistakes. It's just to show the trends of qualifying, especially in the opening third or so of the campaign, that have often been decisive for Hamilton against Russell. There are fewer concrete examples of this being a significant loss in recent events though, which indicates Hamilton is on a better trajectory again. So let's explore that next. Russell has been ahead a lot more often in 2024, but the margins have been super tight. We've compared their qualifying performances in relevant sessions, which means if one driver got knocked out of an early qualifying segment, for example, we've taken their times from the last segment they both participated in. We've also ignored two anomalous qualifyings entirely: China, where Hamilton was knocked out in Q1, and Hungary, where Russell was knocked out in Q1, as their lap times were not really representative and skew the data. And we've ignored Belgium qualifying too, the only properly wet session of the year, because it's in the dry where Hamilton's issues manifest themselves. And just to be clear, these are proper Grand Prix qualifying sessions, not any of the Friday sprint ones. That results in a deficit of 0.13%, or just over 1/10 of a second around a hypothetical 79-second lap, which we're using based on the average of all the pole position times in 2024 from the races that we're comparing these drivers. Hopefully that makes sense, but what you basically need to know is that even discounting 2 of the 4 times Hamilton's outqualified Russell, he is at worst just over 1/10 slower on average. As he puts it, not a disaster, and probably above average given how good Russell is, but we have come to expect more than that from the driver with the most poles in F1 history. One thing that stands out on closer inspection is how the comparison changes either side of some crucial Mercedes upgrades. Various changes to the floor and, just as importantly, the front wing have helped turn Mercedes' season around, from being nowhere in the early races to winning 3 of 4 Grand Prix before the summer break. The developments have given the car a better balance at high speed and low speed, and been a pursuit of more downforce. The car's become easier to set up, it's more predictable, and the drivers can attack with more confidence. That seems to have helped Hamilton in particular. He's given away a lot less to Russell now and started to outqualify him a bit more. Both drivers have improved their numbers substantially since getting a new front wing that came in the middle of a run of updates. For Hamilton specifically, his average grid position over the first 8 races was a meager 9.5, and his average finishing position was 7.57, but since he first used the front wing in Canada in early June, his average grid position has improved to 4.17 and his average finishing position is 2.67. That seems a lot less disastrous than made out by the prevailing narrative just a few races ago. How much of this might be down to Hamilton finally finding a way to adapt to the demands of this car? Hamilton has typically been very good in very different cars after all, so sooner or later he was bound to mitigate the worst of his issues. But this is different to the various changes in car behaviour and characteristics that Hamilton has encountered across a lengthy career. It's a more fundamental clash in his preference versus what the car needs. Can you teach an old dog new tricks? Well, Hamilton's way of driving is deeply ingrained in him, and unpicking that at 39 years old, nearly 20 years into driving F1 cars, is not going to happen. He joked that "I'm a Capricorn, so I'm stubborn" when we asked how he'd approach trying to adapt to the challenges of these cars, whether he was trying to rewire himself or just deal with it the best he can. Hamilton's more serious point was that he's tried to keep driving the way he wants to, even though it doesn't always work. That explains the peaks and troughs, because sometimes the car will be able to cope, and the better the car, the more forgiving it will be, but sometimes Hamilton will suffer for this, and in general, even at his relative best in these cars, he's still lacking a little something versus Russell. Hamilton's adamant you have to hold on to the essence of what made you as good as you've been. A good comparison would be Daniel Ricciardo, who encountered the bizarre McLaren car characteristics in 2021 and 2022 and was encouraged by the team to reconfigure his driving technique to replicate what Lando Norris was doing. That should have unlocked a higher peak, but Ricciardo was never able to adapt to driving the McLaren way naturally. It became extremely disjointed and left him even worse off than before. Hamilton's avoided doing that. Earlier in the year, he and Russell would help each other through trying different experiments with setup and driving style, then study each other's data between sessions. They usually aren't too far apart on setup now, and what works for one tends to work pretty well for the other. Hamilton's driving style hasn't become drastically different, but he seems to be showing a little more restraint in how he attacks the corners, so he's not asking things of the car that it can't handle because he's not overreaching. And at the same time, the car's got better, so he is able to drive with a little more confidence and maybe gets away with driving his way a bit more than before. This has eliminated the worst of the oscillations in his qualifying performances and made Hamilton a consistently better qualifier as the year has progressed. Hamilton outqualified Russell 3 times in 5 races before the break, so this is undoubtedly his best spell of the season. Maybe, to use his word, Hamilton has sucked at qualifying at times in the last couple of years and in the first part of this season, but you couldn't accuse him of that based on the last few events. And in any case, Hamilton's not being beaten on Saturdays by a mid-grid journeyman driver. Russell's super fast and a potential world champion in the right car. If you factor in absolutely everything, Hamilton's age, the possibility that these cars limit his output fractionally, and Russell's own ability, then Hamilton shipping a 10th on Saturdays isn't the end of the world, especially as Sundays can still go really well. His race pace, his judgment and his time management are still top tier. He remains one of the very best in wet conditions, and his feeling in the cars still immense because he's often quicker than Russell when the grip is low or practice is disrupted, then gets caught as the weekend progresses, like was the case in Canada. Russell's retirement at Silverstone and disqualification after winning at Spa have warped the championship picture, but it doesn't change the fact that Hamilton's pulling his own season back into shape. The race results are becoming much more like what we expect. It's just as good as Hamilton clearly still is on Sundays. If he starts behind his teammate more often than not, he'll always be giving himself a bit more work to do. We briefly referenced Hamilton's age just now, and the obvious question being asked by many when Hamilton looks like he's struggling is whether we are simply seeing him diminish as a driver at the end of his career. Age affects different drivers in different ways. There is no consensus on when the peak should be anymore, let alone when an individual driver's level might begin to decline. Reaction speeds are pretty much unrelated to how fast someone can drive a car because it's more about feeling. We know Hamilton admits to asking himself the key question in times of doubt: is it me? Maybe a tiny bit of his sharpness has been blunted by age or by an artificial ceiling from this generation of car. But is it a combination of both or other factors that we haven't even considered? We can't know for sure, and even though the wow moments have become more rare, it's obvious that Hamilton's still an extremely high caliber driver. It's what makes his impending Ferrari move in 2025 so fascinating. Saturdays won't get any less challenging when he trades Russell for Charles Leclerc, regarded by many as the outright fastest driver in F1 over a single lap. And unlike Hamilton, Leclerc's spoken enthusiastically about adapting to this set of car rules, having done so extremely effectively very early in 2022. So is Hamilton about to discover that he only needs a different team or a better car to finally click with the ground effect era? Or will next season confirm something more fundamental, a slight but decisive lack of qualifying speed that leaves Hamilton on the wrong side of more fine margins and relying on more Sunday heroics?